Back in September of 2010, NVIDIA unveiled the new Kepler microarchitecture. Debuting with the GTX 680 on March 22, 2012, Kepler brought improved power efficiency, faster clock speeds, and most importantly, reduced thermal output over their previously sweltering Fermi refreshes. But in the 7 years since its initial release, Kepler has been at the center of some pretty hot controversy regarding NVIDIA and their drivers. Now, whether that's true or not, many cards supporting the GK chips have started to drop down in price, and the previously mid-range and high-end offerings can be found for the price of a GT 1030. So is it worth picking up one of these older cards if you're on a tight budget? And how does performance compare to a newer mid-range offering? So to represent Kepler, we've chosen the GTX 660 and the GTX 760. Both of these cards were considered excellent purchases back in their time, and we picked them up for $50 each. Spec-wise, the GTX 760 is more powerful than the previous generation card, rocking 20% more CUDA cores and texture mapping units. This thing has some specs that actually aren't too far off the 3GB GTX 1060. But the ultimate downside to both the 760 and 660 is their limited 2GB of video memory. In modern AAA games, 3GB of VRAM is now the minimum you need in order to enjoy smooth 60fps gameplay. So right off the bat, both of these cards are at a pretty big disadvantage. Now, to represent a modern mid-range GPU, we've got the GTX 1060 6GB. Releasing back in July of 2016, this card actually isn't too different in terms of on-paper specs from the 6-year-old 760, but what it does have is much more video memory and a more efficient architecture. Now, we know the 1060 will cream both of these older cards, it's just a fact, but the purpose of this video is just to see how close we can get to matching the performance of a much more expensive card using GPUs that we bought for less than a quarter of the price. So how do these older cards perform when matched against some new games? Okay, so to test the cards, we used our usual setup, which features an i3 8350K overclocked to 4.4 GHz, 32GB of DDR4, and a 480GB Timetech SSD to store our OS with a 2TB HDD to store our games. So without any further ado, let's get into this. So starting off with our synthetic tests, the ashes of the Singularity GPU bench didn't do as poorly as we thought it was going to, and both the GTX 660 and 760 were able to hold their own against their much bigger brother, the 1060. With both the Kepler cards being able to stay well above playable frame rates, I'd say that although the newer Pascal card was definitely able to throw the older cards for a loop, they definitely were able to turn out some pretty respectable results. Moving on, our second synthetic test was the Universe Sandbox 2 Earth and Sphere of Moon simulation, and at medium settings and 1080p, the older Kepler cards once again turned out some pretty impressive results for 6 and 7 year old cards. Now, do they compare to the much newer GTX 1060? Not really, but coming in at $50, these cards are performing remarkably well. So moving on from our synthetic tests, the first game we tested was Battlefield 5, and at low settings at 1080p, both of the Kepler GPUs returned some pretty playable frame rates. Turning the resolution down to 900p would definitely improve the FPS, but when you're playing the game, there isn't much stutter to speak of, and the game feels pretty phenomenal to play. The next game we tested didn't fare so well on the 660 and 760, and I think it's the 2GB of VRAM coming back in to haunt us. Black Ops 4's Blackout mode is a lot of fun to play, but as you can see from the graph, the older GTX cards had the same averages, and this is the problem I was talking about. When using the 1060, even on low settings, this game uses nearly 4GB of video memory, and this is a 6GB card. When using the 2GB cards, I can imagine that the game is tapping out their memory and causing some pretty severe memory bandwidth issues, which isn't the card's fault, but this highlights the issues that having 2GB of VRAM brings. So the next game we tested was Fortnite, and at 1080p in medium settings, both of the older Kepler cards returned excellent frame rates, and stuck above 60fps nearly the entire time. So if you wanted to play Fortnite on something older, like a GTX 760 or 660, then for $50 you definitely would have an excellent and admittedly fun experience. So the last game we tested today was PLAYUNKOWN'S Battlegrounds, and at medium settings at 1080p, all the cards tested today performed very well and returned what I would be considered very playable frame rates. While they're significantly lower than the 1060, both the Kepler cards are still very playable, and if you wanted more performance, then turning the resolution down to 900p wouldn't make the game look any less functional. Either way, I'd happily play PUBG on either of these cards. So individual benchmarks are nice, but what does this all ultimately translate to? Well, on average, the GTX 1060 is about 36% faster than the GTX 760 and about 70% faster than the 660. For being nearly 7 years old, I have to say, although Kepler has had some controversy surrounding it, it's still pretty impressive what these older GK-based GPUs can do. Are they Pascal killers? Well, not really. But the GTX 760, especially the 4GB variant if you can find it, would be a great alternative to lower end cards such as the GTX 1050. But keep in mind that these older Kepler cards do draw more power than the newer Pascal based cards. We've really been spoiled by Pascal the past couple of years, and it's really impressive to see the performance you can get for the amount of total wattage that these cards pull. Kepler, however, although significantly better than Fermi, still isn't as good as Pascal or even Maxwell for that matter, in terms of raw power draw, and you'd be getting 1050 level performance at 1060 or even 1070 level power consumption. Thermals, although not terrible, still aren't that great either. The 660 never got above 70C under load, but the 760 was hitting 80C left and right after some prolonged gaming sessions, which is still under the manufacturer tolerances, but it's still dumping the heat into your room, which admittedly can kinda get uncomfortable after a little while. But despite all the issues, performance, especially from the GTX 760, is very commendable, and when considering that we bought these cards for $50, an older Kepler card would definitely make a great GPU in a budget system. Well, yes, there are some limitations. Kepler is still showing some pretty strong signs of life, and although you might be turned away due to the age of these cards, I'd argue to actually check them out. The 700 series of cards seems to be the best option right now, with the GTX 780 going for less than $100. You can't go wrong with one of these cards. If you're building a budget 1080p system, then one of the older Kepler cards might be able to do the trick, but they aren't the end-all be-all. Like I mentioned earlier, there still are some pretty big limitations to these cards. Whether it be the VRAM or the power consumption, these cards are definitely still older tech, and as such you should try to manage your expectations if you're looking to buy a GK-based GPU. But that doesn't mean they aren't still a good buy if you're on a tight budget. Are Kepler cards the 1050 killer? Well, maybe. So thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe and click the bell icon so you'll be notified about all our future uploads. And also, thank you for 800 subscribers. We've been growing so incredibly quickly lately, and I can't begin to thank you guys enough for all the support. So thanks for making this year a great first year, and I can't wait to see what year 2 has in store for us. So thanks again for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.